everyone, and a warm welcome to UK Column. I'm Liz Evans, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a good friend of UK Column, who I am proud to call a friend to. Dr. David Cartland is here to discuss his new book, Do No Harm, Diaries of a Vaccinated Anti-Vaxxer, and just show you my copy, and to catch up with what's been happening in his life since he last spoke to us in 2023. So I'm sure that Dr. Cartland is well known to most of our audience, but in case you don't know him, David was until recently a highly experienced general practitioner GP in Cornwall. He is eminently qualified in both science and medicine. His first degree was in Biomedical Science, studying immunology, virology, microbiology and medical statistics, and passing with first-class honours. He then went on to Birmingham Medical School, qualifying as a doctor in 2008, and also has an MSc in medical research. Now, David has been a hero and inspiration to so many of us with his selfless and courageous whistleblowing from 2021 about serious side effects from the COVID jabs that he was witnessing on the front line as a GP and in A&E. And in putting his head above the parapet to speak truth to power, calling out corruption and challenging the official COVID narrative at great cost. He is truly the epitome of what it means to be a compassionate and ethical doctor, risking and ultimately losing his career to uphold his Hippocratic oath to do no harm, putting his patients' interests and safety above his own and refusing to stay silent despite ruthless persecution, which tragically led to David being struck off the medical register earlier this year. Now, UK Column interviewed Dr. Cartland in February 2022 and July 2023, and I'm going to put the links to these two interviews in the show notes. So do listen to these or read the first half of David's book to hear the story of the first 2 to 3 years of his COVID fight. And I'm sure we will touch on that in the next hour or so, but a lot has happened since then, which I really want to focus on in our conversation today. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us, David. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Liz. It's a pleasure, as always, to speak on the UK Column. But yeah, I've probably aged a little bit since we last spoke.
I think you're looking remarkably well. So I'm going to start by talking about how you describe in your book how becoming a doctor was your life dream, and at your degree ceremony, how you stood proudly and recited the Hippocratic Oath. And throughout your book, your ethical conviction shines through alongside your disgust at your colleagues' failure to uphold informed consent and their lack of courage to raise patient concerns during the COVID era. You were truly a voice crying in the wilderness and no one was listening. So my first question is, why are medical ethics so important to you? And why do you think most of the medical profession failed to uphold them during COVID and just follow the narrative?
No, it's a great question, and it's sort of central, really, to my stand, as you mentioned in the book. It's it's at the centre of all that we do. Every patient we see, every consult we conduct. The centrepiece of it is medical ethics. Whether that is, particularly around informed consent was the focus for the COVID vaccine rollout, and we just simply weren't getting informed consent. That was it. End of story. No information was exchanged, and the doctors pressing the plunger weren't even aware of what they were pressing into the patient or where it went and for how long. So, just on every corner there was an ethical breach, really. And also when there's coercion to do something, coercion invalidates consent because there's been a variable that kind of pressurizes you, such as travel or work, etc. And it's a really important tenet of what we do. And a lot of what I did in my first degree was around medical ethics. If you've got no ethics as a doctor, you may as well not bother getting out of bed in the morning, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a privilege, isn't it, to be a doctor? And you have such a position of power in that situation because the patient is vulnerable. They're coming to you. You've got more knowledge than them. You've got access to all these drugs and interventions. And if we don't have medical ethics, that you're going to end up with abuse and atrocities happening. I mean, that's what I've always said. It's like that is the essential framework within which a doctor-patient consultation can happen safely. And so were you surprised at the lack of moral or ethical conviction of your colleagues?
Yeah, I kind of look in retrospect at the behaviour of the mass of colleagues, really, because, it would have only took about I've always said 200 or 300 doctors doing what I've done to step up to the plate. And there's a thing called the Boland principle, isn't there? As long as there's a responsible body of medical opinion that agrees, then you're obviously not in the wilderness completely. But yeah, it did surprise me. But at the same time, they've kept doctors busy. They've kept doctors flat out, running on fumes really for the last 10 years, really. My whole career has really been a bad patch for primary care, really. And, easy pickings, really, because, everyone was subject to the same propaganda. We saw the fear porn, as I call it, the fear porn that was used, the PSYOPs, military grade, really, at times, wasn't it? And, it duped many people, more so the academics, really. But, at the same time, they have to follow the orders, they have to follow guidance. That's another tenet of medical practice. It's guideline based. Mm-hmm. And that's very different from my first degree. I spoke about that a lot, that my first degree taught me to critically think, critically appraise, question everything, look for conflicts of interest, look at the financial backing behind papers. Papers can sometimes contradict the body of the text in their conclusions. We've seen that recently with a lot of the sort of vaccine harm stuff. I'm disappointed because, all of the people that have spoken out have been picked off one by one. And I can't explain it. It's not been a pleasurable experience. I often get asked, you wish you kept your mouth shut. Some days I feel like I should have done, but other times I think about looking my grandkids in the eyes, if I'm honest, and them asking me, Grandad, what did you do to stop this? Whatever this ends up being, what did you do to stop it? And I've put my head above the parapet, as you say, and lost my career for it, but. It's kind of meant to be, I think. I don't think I could have gone back to NHS practice, really, given some of the antics in the last 5 years. And had a little stint back in general practice just before I was ruled to be a danger to the public and bringing the profession into disrepute. And it just wasn't fun. I became a pill pusher again very quickly, 10-minute processing of a patient. They'd waited weeks and weeks to see you and, a multitude of problems that I just couldn't even scratch the surface of. So, yeah, I'm glad I'm kind of in a new version of myself, really, as a health coach now, and reinventing myself and better off out, to be honest. There's a lot of things that I don't like about medicine looking back, really, the culture. We've seen it with the COVID era. I've seen it through my career where you whistleblow. You don't whistleblow for the fun of it. You whistleblow because you've got a genuinely held concern about an issue around the practice, usually safety concern. But they've kind of rebranded it now to freedom to speak up guardianship, haven't they? And kind of like a rebrand. But when you speak up, you're not free because you may as well pick up your P45 on the way out of the building. That's how it's turned out to be. And you kind of get made to feel a troublemaker just for having the sort of patient safety at the centre of all that you do. And a bit of a sort of, like a rebel rouser, really, if you do raise concerns with management. Then there is a culture of cover-up in the NHS, that's clear, and a culture of bullying. And, most of my GMC complaints came from either anonymous trolls, which I know we're going to talk about, or usually snitches from the medical profession. And, the GMC protect the names and the identities of these people. I had about 250 reports, I think, in the end. And it was just Dr Cartland spreading misinformation. That was the bulk of it. There was never any qualification as to what misinformation. There was never any offer of debate. I've never had any debate, I don't think, in the whole 5 years, really. And there was never any rebuttal data. If they've Cartland spreading misinformation like it's unsafe in pregnancy, well, show me the safety data in pregnancy, and then that's how you get people to be, accept its debate. It was what we used to do at the beginning of my career, and then the COVID era happened, and debate went out of the picture. It was just suddenly en masse, no discussion. It's safe and effective. If you speak out, you're Wakefielded, as I call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, though, now looking back, I think when we came into COVID, we already had very shaky ethical foundations. I think you're right. The more we've turned to guidelines and protocols, the more we've started to dismantle ethical medicine over probably the last 20 or 30 years. And as you say, that this is very well documented even before COVID, how whistleblowers are treated so badly in the NHS. They're encouraged to come forward, and then there was a big Telegraph investigation fairly recently showing that they're harassed, they're bullied, they're reported to, their line managers, they're reported to their regulatory agencies, and, given a really hard time, which suggests that we've gone so far away from, I think, when you and I both, I trained in the 90s, and I think it was a totally different ballgame then, medicine. So I think this probably couldn't have happened 50 years ago. Do you agree? Do you think that they couldn't have pulled this off in the sort of old culture where doctors had real autonomy and they were respected and they were able to operate it with their clinical judgment? They weren't following protocols and, you know, privacy, confidentiality, your doctor-patient relationship was privileged. You know, you couldn't just share information. So there was all of that going on. What are your thoughts on that?
I think my career's kind of spanned that era as well, where, you know, the good old fashioned, you know, old school GPs, for example, you know, and risk takers, like you say, it wasn't as focused on guidance or pharmaceuticals. I know now, even just towards the back end of my career, we know in all of the chronic disease management, NICE guidance, for example, there's always that section before you go onto drugs, you go for intense lifestyle management. And they sort of skip over that now because, again, we're financial benefits, to be honest with you. I mean, GPs get paid because they satisfy their QOF registers and get everyone who's got blood pressure issues under a certain cut-off, everyone's cholesterol under a certain cut-off. And we've seen the medical curriculum change as well, and I saw that in the difference between the 2 degrees that, as I mentioned, it taught me critical thinking. It underpinned a lot of the medical curriculum with the science and the root cause. You know, a lot of what we do in medicine is just sticking plasters, really. Patient comes in, they've got hyponatremia, you correct it and you boot them out. You don't ask yourself, well, why has that person got low sodium, for example? You just correct the correctables and off you trot. And again, that's that culture about, you know, overrun hospitals, there's too many patients, not enough doctors, and everyone's running around on fumes. As I mentioned, morale is low. And I think that's changed. I've felt the morale shift in the sort of latter 5 years. Everyone's just flogging themselves day in, day out. Yeah, I remember back to my sort of junior years, they were really good old school doctors, and they would risk take and they would say things, you know, like now we're hearing about doctors that are, when they're clerking in a patient, they'll say, how many vaccines did you have? Oh, but I can't document it. But back in the day, they would have done if they spotted a trend that, you know, people having strokes in their 20s had all exclusively been COVID jabbed in the recent days before then. You know, you would have probably had the confidence to speak out. And I think there was more of a togetherness back then as well. There's an isolation around working as a doctor now. As I mentioned, you're flat out. I used to go to my room in primary care and not leave. You go out to make a coffee, self-catheterise occasionally, and on your way to a home visit, and you were just flat out, and you never see another human apart from the patients in front of you. But
and presumably, I think, you know, with the short consultations as well, 5 to 10 minutes is so short. What else can you do but reach for a drug? There is no time to discuss anything that you have. I presume you don't really have time to examine anyone. You know, we were always taught it's so important to take a full history. Then you need to examine the patient. You don't do tests until you're kind of, you know, 70% of the way through, where you've already got a differential diagnosis in your head. Then you do your testing. Then you start to talk about, you know, the non-pharmaceutical option. You don't have time to do any of that as a GP in 5 to 10 minutes. It must be such a unsatisfactory way to practice medicine.
Well, on top of that, I mean, to pass out as a GP, you have to not only have the knowledge, like you say, the history, the examination and further testing, but there's this kind of like polished way of passing your exam. You have to consider the patient's presenting problem in the context of the biology of it, the psychology of it, and the social aspects of it. So it's a biopsychosocial approach, they called it. So you had to see, you know, when you do your driving test, you do mirror signal maneuver. That was very much what you're trained to do as a GP. And as well as that, then you have to address the patient's ideas, concerns and expectation. So again, if you don't address that, then you're going to have an unhappy punter at the end of it, because if they think their headache's a brain tumour and you don't reassure them that it's not a brain tumour, then they're just going to return, you know, for another 5-minute appointment next week with another doctor usually. So if I was to practice medicine like that, you know, you'd be having to need 45 minutes per patient. And, you know, you're doing these 20 patient clinics back to back, and, you know, you're juggling mental health with gynae, breast lumps, prostate issues, and mental health and everything in between. So, yeah, it was not a very satisfactory end to the career anyway. So I kind of thank the GMC in a sort of perverse way, thank them for releasing me. But I don't like the reputational stuff that's gone with it, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, we will definitely. So before we move on to that, though, have you always been kind of awake and questioning, or is this something that came to you during COVID? So before, you know, in that first 10 years of your career, were you going along with the consensus generally, or did you always have quite an independent maverick streak to you? Would you question things when they didn't make sense?
I think you just nailed it with that phrase, independent maverick. And again, that would be tarnished with troublemaker. You know, you're going around saying, you know, I think these appointment times are a bit too short. Can I have a couple of minutes extra? And, you know, you get slapped down essentially. So yeah, and the centre of what I did has always been patient safety. I know it sounds a bit soft, but that's what you do. You sign up to be a doctor to look out for your patients, to help them, and the safety is the principal point in that consultation. So yeah, no, I've always been a bit of a maverick. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, obviously I took the jab for starters, so it kind of tells its own story. I believed it. I used to watch the BBC and watch people dropping in the streets and questioning it. Don't get me wrong, I questioned it, but I was kept busy. I was doing full-time general practice, urgent care, some A&E shifts at the time, so really wasn't that interested, to be honest. I was chatting to people who had COVID, variations on man flu, really. That's all I was getting from triaging these people. Certainly wasn't hospitalising anyone, particularly any young people, pregnant women, or, healthy adults with no comorbidity. But yeah, so I took the vaccine more and more due to the coercion of, taking, the mandate was coming. And I think it was a matter of days before the mandate was reversed that I bottled it one fateful day and rolled my sleeve up. I won't repeat exactly what I said, but it wasn't informed consent. It was kind of under duress. And so, yeah, that was it. And, started to see really the whole principle for me was ethics, as we talked about already, the lockdown, saying, well, this is unprecedented. There's going to be collateral damage here financially, mental health, etc. Masking, just seeing bonkers, particularly when boxes state clearly these are not for protection around COVID-19. It actually says it on the boxes. And then some of the silly rules were coming in, bubbles and rules of 6. And, you need to wear a mask until you sit down and eat a steak, and then you're good, you're protected. The steak and chips are highly protective, allegedly, for the wild type strain. And just weird rules.
Crazy times.
And then suddenly the answer to all this, the vaccine, it's safe, it's effective. Lots and lots of propaganda, lots of fear, lots of celebrities bad-mouthing people who decided to exercise their bodily autonomy. And it really, for me, came down to my full awakening was from seeing the vaccine injured, in my room, in a clinic room, in the middle of Penzance where I live, little surgery, not on many patients really, and spotting the trends of the fact that all the people that were getting alleged COVID had 2 jabs to stop them getting COVID, and they were the ones that were occupying the hospitals. And I remember the data at the time, the UK HSA data showing that, upwards of initially 70, but then 80% of deaths and hospital admissions were in the double vaccinated at the time. That was before the booster idea was born. And as soon as that booster went in, that for me was the real trigger warning. People were coming to me. It wasn't me suggesting that it was a vaccine. They were saying, I had that jab yesterday or 3 days ago. I've not felt right. And now I'm getting chest pain. And lo and behold, it turns out to be a PE. And one particular week, we had 2 females die in their 40s. And it said, coroner confirmed post-mortem VIT vaccine-induced thrombocytic thrombocytopenia, death by 1,000 clots. Must have been a horrible death for these 2 women. I had to make the condolence call to one particular husband. And on that same week, we had a man collapse. He'd had the jab yesterday, and he had a cerebral venous thrombosis the following day, seizing in the street. Get a call from the neurosurgeon telling me that, this guy's having a cerebral venous thrombosis removed from his brain. And I said, you don't think it could be the vaccine? And he had it yesterday. And that's the first ever time I've been called that fateful word, anti-vaxxer, by the neurosurgical reg. She said, you're not one of those anti-vaxxers, are you? And I recounted that. And I mean, that weekend they jabbed, all 3 were AstraZeneca, 2 deaths and 1 cerebral venous thrombosis. Told the guy running the vaccine centre, saying, look, these are the death certificates. This is a guy who's just contacted me from Derriford Hospital, locally, the neurosurgical centre. And he went on to jab 500 people that weekend with AstraZeneca. Now, if I give somebody...
So just thinking about these colleagues of yours who, must have been seeing the same thing as you. You can't have been the only GP in Cornwall who was getting all of the vaccine injured. And yet, do you think psychologically it was almost too much cognitive dissonance? They were in too deep. They were so bought in to this narrative, and they were so, in it and colluding with it, that they literally just covered their ears, covered their eyes, and just refused to admit what was going on, and just dug themselves deeper into a hole. Is that kind of how you saw it?
Put it this way, if I'd been jabbing pregnant women and children with the COVID-19 vaccines, I'd be keeping my head well down. I say there was an actual pandemic that did happen over the 5 years, ostrich syndrome. And that's what they are. You've got this cognitive dissonance, that kind of not wanting to even just talk about it. You don't want to hear Dave Cartland talking about the multi-systemic inflammatory effects and autoimmunity that it induces, because guess what? They've had 3 or 4 themselves. Well, saying that, a lot of the NHS staff said no, didn't they? The uptake of the flu vaccine this year has been rubbish. Great news. The COVID vaccine bottomed out after 2. Most doctors and nurses stopped after the 2. They didn't take the booster. So, 80% of the NHS are anti-vaxxers according to that. And you just have to ask yourself, what are they seeing? What are they seeing? And it's always a whisper. In the last role, people were coming into my room, tapping me on my shoulder. Well done, Dave. You've done really good. People were recognising me, patients and staff, and almost like locking the door and making sure no one saw that they were having these conversations. How are you dealing with these vaccine injuries, Dave? What are you giving them? What are you recommending? Behind closed doors. I've offered to give every Cornish practice a free hour of my time to talk about spike protein detox. No one answered the email. Surprisingly. So I don't know, I can't explain it. There's willful blindness, there's buyer's remorse as well, if you don't want people to
and maybe a lack of intellectual humility, like in a sense, because you'd also had a couple of jabs, but you were able to kind of be more adaptable and change course and say, wow, okay, that didn't work. There's a real situation here. Now I'm going to change my mind. I think people really struggle these days to change their minds once they've taken a position. And how much do you think that whole ideology around vaccines, that sacred cow of medicine, was that the kind of genius Trojan horse within which to bring this, bioweapon, as some people describe it, because doctors were so blinded to vaccines ever causing any harm, that it was something that was above reproach?
I mean, we were actually warned. I remember the medical school lecture. It was our one and only lecture on vaccines and immunology. Bearing in mind, I'd done months and months in the previous degree. Don't question the vaccines. Cultish really it was, because, and that's where the phrase Wakefielded came from. It came from a medical lecturer at med school back then. Don't speak out because you'll be Wakefielded. And I would never have believed that possible had it not been completely carbon copied in my case. I've been Cartlanded.
I think you've become Cartlanded because, like, what you've experienced, which we'll go on to talk about in a minute, is like Andrew Wakefield on steroids. I mean, they've taken it to a whole nother level. So, you may have your own notoriety in being, the name of.
Well, he got vindicated in the end, didn't he? So I hope in 20 years' time the vindication will come. I'll keep plugging on 100%. For now.
So you became a whistleblower and started to raise COVID jab safety concerns and challenging the narrative with both your colleagues and the public on social media. So what was your kind of experience in that situation, first of all with your colleagues and then when you were bringing it on social media?
Well, when I had my original concerns, like I say, I was a bit academic about it. I started doing audits, looking at all the positive tests, for example, and how many had been vaccinated or unvaccinated. And it was immediately clear that the unvaccinated were not suffering from COVID and they weren't going to hospital with COVID. That was immediately clear. But, I've tried my very best really to try and wake people up the right way, call practice meetings, hold journal meetings. I remember being physically assaulted by a physio because I took a paper in from the JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, about South Korean prospective study, and it was myocarditis risk in adolescents. And he just huffed at me and said, look, this is my downtime. I don't want to hear your conspiracy crap. That was his exact words, and pushed me in the chest, and the room emptied. But I mean, for me, it really hinged on when I first decided to speak out, like I say, fell on deaf ears, these genuine attempts at, asking them, are you seeing the same, like you said earlier? Are you seeing the same as I'm seeing? Am I just seeing a skewed, a set of vaccine injuries every day and you guys aren't? But then it came down to a discussion. It was a coffee room discussion, and we were discussing the fact that they were going for the, is it 11 to 19-year-olds or something like that? It was the pre-20.
Yeah, 11 to 15 maybe.
And then we were just discussing, are you going to have your kids? A lot of the partners had children of that age. I said, would you get your adolescent vaccinated for COVID? He said, oh, no, wouldn't have it. There's no need. There's no clinical indication. We don't know enough about these things. Young people aren't dying of COVID, so there's no need. And then the very next day, in fact, they said to me, we'll not vaccinate people of that age under our roof, was the phrase they used. The very next day on the website, and I can't explain this, but it led to my resignation, they're advertising what I call the jabatoire down the road. So they were advertising this massive, it was a military operation where people would go in one door and out the other, sheep herding, as it were. And they deployed the staff from that surgery to that place to work. So they technically weren't injecting under their roof. They were sending them over to that place. And then I fell out with them, and I publicly resigned. And then all the fun and games happened. I took to social media, podcasts. I think UK Column was the first interview I did with Brian back in the day, where we unmasked me as the vaccinated anti-vaxxer that I am. And that was it. I was just tried everything I could within the system. The system didn't want to hear, so I had an important safety concern that needed to be made clear, particularly around the people I'd targeted, children and pregnant women. These are two groups that are so protected, or should be so protected, by the medical profession. Like, we're telling pregnant women not to eat soft cheese or raw meat and sit and do, just healthy things for 9 months. Most drugs in the BNF state, not tested in pregnancy, but not believed to be, concerning, etc. But then suddenly this technology, and not even the doctors injecting it, not even knowing that it's this novel platform, and the early social media, I was just getting banned like most of the other doctors. I remember doing an interview once where I'm holding up the documents from Moderna and Pfizer, reading them out, holding them up like this to the camera, running my finger along and putting the references at the bottom saying these are immunomodulatory gene therapies that will never be used on humans 6 months before we started using them on humans of ever decreasing ages. And so, I got banned from LinkedIn. I got banned from Instagram and Facebook for that post where I'm holding up the documents, peeping out the side here. And there was no place to kind of get your concerns out, not within house or even on social media. There's this sudden censorship. And then the trolls came a-trolling. I don't know if we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, so you describe so vividly in your book how you were subjected to years of the most brutal and relentless harassment and abuse from this coordinated gang of online trolls, and it was this absolutely disgusting, which really speaks out of the pages of your book, and it even spilled over into your real life. There was you described doxing, hacking, real life stalking, mass anonymous GMC complaints, and even being reported to the police. Yet if you reported these people to the police for all of these sort of criminal actions, the doxing, the hacking, the stalking, no action was ever taken. So it'd be really good to hear a bit more about, like, when did it go from being censored and silenced and kind of, shadow banned to this sort of far more vicious, evil, sort of aggressive attack against you from these trolls?
Well, the irony is one of again, I'm being cautious not to name names because obviously the victims, the victims of Dr. Cartland were treated as vulnerable witnesses and given anonymity orders. But everything Dave Cartland said was going to be beamed out publicly. So it all started with one of my victims. Again, one of the victims was a ringleader, well-known ringleader. He's actually been kicked out of the Irish Medical Council recently for being what he is, a buffoon. But that said, he's the organiser. And so the name of this online troll network is named after him and his business. And again, I'm not going to say any more than that. I actually faced charges of harassing him. I presented the GMC with 600 tweets about me, 600 tweets about other doctors, probably including yourself. Just nasty, ad hominem, vile, abusive stuff. And then this guy went into the vaccine injury group, starting calling people malingerers. Saying, get a job, you lazy, this, that, and the other. And this is a guy that I've been found guilty of harassing him. This evidence was never shown to the GMC. They weren't allowing it. They never allowed me any witnesses, but it was a very strange kangaroo court. But going back to the trolls, it was very organised. Anyone who spoke out in my defence was immediately piled upon. And it's all the same faces even to this day. They're even quite blatant about what they've been doing outside of the Twitterverse. As you mentioned, it's not stopped at the strike-off. It upsets me that I've had so much harassment over 5 years, like unrelenting, and I've been found guilty and struck off for harassment and bullying, something I absolutely abhor. I hate it. Bullied at school. I hate bullies. So to lose my medical career for that. But yeah, they've not stopped short of anything. I went to report 6 of them, 6 of the worst, plucked up all the courage in the world, took an ex-detective with me. And as I walked into the police station, they said, look, you saved us the trip, Dr. Cartland. I said, sorry. And then they said, we were coming to interview you under caution for harassment and malicious communications. I said, sorry, that's what I've come in to report. And that's the 6 names of the characters that had reported me. And they'd reported me over a 2-day period. So 6 reports of Dave Cartland's a bully and a harasser by 6 trolls. And then he read out the 6 names, and they were the 6 people I'd gone in to report. It was just an unbelievable moment, really. And the policeman yawned while I was telling him the story, the tale of woe. He actually physically yawned during the interview. Anyway, that was all thrown out. And like I say, we've had things like social service contact. The last job I worked at a surgery, they received 2 anonymous male tip-offs saying that Dr. Cartland's a bully and a harasser, he's about to be struck off. I was very open and honest with that surgery about what was going on in the background. I talked them through the charge sheet, as it were. And they were happy with it, but they let me go because they didn't want the negative publicity, because these two male trolls, who were quite openly gloating on X that it was them, they were doing the people of Cornwall a service of getting rid of me, as they see it, and they probably still see it. They see themselves as champions of disinformation. I mean, the GMC tribunal started, and we read out two things. We read out a number of death threats and incidents of physical stalking. And then we read out an email, and it was quite sinister. I remember it to this day. And it said, I can remember the words. It said, "We are a group of doctors and scientists on the X/formerly Twitter platform who have been tasked with keeping misinformation regarding COVID off this platform. Dr. Cartland was a particularly obnoxious example of somebody spreading misinformation, which is why he became a target of our network." And then the GMC redacted the name of the individual who'd signed that email. So they're telling the GMC that I've been targeted by a group of doctors, malicious doctors and scientists. And then the death threats. And then they went away, the GMC deliberated over it and said, we'll grant vulnerable witness status to these guys. And Dave Cartland's going to be public and beamed out. And they even allowed trolls into the tribunal. Even allowed trolls. They were advertising that they were selling memorabilia, they're popping corks at my demise, and just a nasty level of trolling. And like I say, it's that they haven't left my refereeing career alone. One of my bits of sanity at the weekend is to run around a football pitch and take charge of football matches, youth football, adult football, veterans, women's football. And they've come after that. The FA are getting several reports every single week about me from anonymous trolls saying he's transphobic, he's a bully, he's this, that and the other. You don't really want this guy refereeing. And then we've got this, I know we're going to talk about the DBS. They're looking at...
Yeah, do you want to bring that up now? That'd be...
Yeah, I mean, it's trickle treat.
Stopped at your striking off. I think this is the point, isn't it? It's like this harassment it's very sinister, actually, because how would they even know? For example, I know in the book, it was like, how did they even know where you were working? You were 2 hours away from your house. So this suggests a level of stalking, which is well beyond, just dropping into your local surgery where he works or ringing them up. This is like orchestrated, high level, high funded, and very determined. I mean, one of the guys is an ophthalmologist from Nottingham. He travelled all the way to Wiltshire to sit 3 seats away from me, advertised the fact he'd arrived at one of the World Council for Health meetings in Wiltshire. He's also travelled this summer to Cornwall, and he was taking pictures of me refereeing a veterans match. This is where I went to a beach. They posted the webcam of the beach I was at. Cartland's arrived at the beach with his family. And they were posting the webcam of me physically there with the kids building sandcastles. Cartland can't be at work today because we've seen him take his children to and from school. # we've got eyes everywhere. I mean, it's so sinister. And, if I started posting things like that about some of them, I know that I'd get a knock on the door. So it needs to be, there's 2-tier policing around online thought policing and social media posting. I mean, the GMC's view was that if I write something about a doctor, one of the doctors was an obstetrician saying it was safe in pregnancy long term, 100% safe. So I pulled her up on that. This woman wrote about me 17 times. I tweeted 3 things about her, and they weren't particularly offensive. It's thank Dr. X for inflicting spike protein upon your newborn. 3 tweets. Verses 17, I was found guilty of harassment, and it was upheld, of this obstetrician who was just following guidance. She told the story about how I was murdering pregnant women and babies, and she held the hand of a woman that, because of people like David Cartland spreading misinformation, she slipped away and she handed the baby over to this sobbing widow as she took her last breath. And she had the panel sobbing. She happens to run the maternity COVID inquiry, and ran a trial around pregnancy safety of the vaccine. Which wasn't established. It's classic abuse, isn't it? That you're accused of the thing that they're doing to you. I mean, it's that kind of sort of satanic inversion that's going on. And the fact is it is a criminal offence to stalk people. Yeah. You can't just turn up and stalk them and dox them. And I think it just shows how far the rot has gone, that you had no recourse in this situation, that it wasn't just the GMC, but it was the court, it's the police, and now you've been contacted by the DBS. So tell us about that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because one of the things I was going to say is that they brought in the big guns for me. So I'm little old Dave Cartland down in Cornwall, who's whistleblowing. They brought in the head of the CPS London.
There's no higher barrister in the land to be the legally qualified chair of the panel. And they brought in a homicide terrorist barrister as the GMC, $6,000 a day representation. And he just lied and lied and lied. They banned all my witnesses. They banned all my witness statements. My own witness bundle, half of it they lost. They said I didn't respond to one of the 5 complaints. I didn't file a defence. Well, I've got a read receipt from the GMC showing that I actually did, and the lawyer and the investigation officer had received it, but published in the NPTS report. Dr Cartland didn't even bother furnishing the NPTS with a defence. As I mentioned, one of the other doctors has been booted out of another tribunal for being a questionable character, and that's all I say. But yeah, going back to the DBS, trick or treat night, there's doors knocking, kids are coming around, and I thought it was a trick or treater, so I opened the door expecting to give sweets out, and I had to sign for a package. And the package states that it's from the DBS, the Criminal Records Bureau, that's been slightly rebranded now. So this is the list you go on if you've committed a crime. Now, I'll make the point at this juncture, really, that considering I've been found guilty of 3 cases of harassment, if I harass somebody, there's 2 recourses. You can either sue them or you can go to the police and report them as a crime. None of those things have ever happened. I've been found guilty by a tribunal of harassment with no crime number, no police contact, and no successful civil action. So completely outside of their jurisdiction, really. And then, I mean, this letter really basically says that it's automatic if you're struck off. They've actually worded the charge as, because you were struck off for, quote, emotionally abusing vulnerable adults. Now, these are, again, I'm not going to give identity information out, but these are practicing people, practicing doctors, professionals, practice managers. And then the other thing I did, the other crime, I gave 5 people letters of support for exercising their bodily autonomy. That wasn't necessary because people can say no, with a valid refusal of consent with capacity. And it was basically just an insurance policy. During 23, people contacted me saying, I've got to get to Canada. My mum's got cancer. It's on a deathbed. I need to get over there. Can you write a letter just in case I have to show it to somebody in immigration or a jobs worth stewardess? And that was it. And they never had to show any of them. GMC call it falsification of medical records for money originally. And this is where it kind of fell on the strike-off. They used this to justify the strike-off, saying that it was irremediable behaviour, dishonesty. They really played on this dishonesty. Well, how do you know about these letters? Because I've admitted to doing them. And that came about, funnily enough, from entrapment. Again, the GMC are above the law. They got somebody to book in an appointment with me, asked for a medical exemption for a business trip to Canada, make or break, he described it. And then he said, I haven't got a medical reason, doc, does that matter? I said, no, primum non nocere, first do no harm. And the second reason is your bodily autonomy is sacrosanct, and you don't even, you don't need to justify that.
If you can't get informed consent as a doctor, then that is an exemption. If the person will not freely consent to it, if they do not want it, then that is your exemption. I mean, we've argued that. We set up something called PROMIC, which was giving forms to people for the doctors to certify, I cannot get informed consent for this drug. Therefore, they are exempt because they are under coercion, and that is against my professional code and against the law. So we cannot coerce people into having medical treatment. So, what you were doing was entirely in line with good medical practice and your GMC code of conduct.
So this is what I'm saying, where the GMC have then coded that as Dr. Cartland as falsified medical records. And interestingly, about 2 years before this GMC case was cobbled together, they kept adding bits to it. They were going to let me off. They sent me an email saying, we'll let you off these 5 letters that you've admitted to doing in your rebuttal, as long as you have for 2 years on your GMC record that you falsified medical records. And I was like, well, I'm not going to admit to that because I have not touched anyone's medical records. I've written a standalone justification that the person can honour their own refusal, bodily autonomy. Anyway, the reason I mention that now is because, and bearing in mind the GMC had no copies of these letters, so it's just Dave's admission. We asked them to furnish the NPTS with the physical letter. We couldn't. We asked them which law and regulation I broke, because this is the accusation that Cartland flouted international policy and safeguarding regulations. And they quote that. The reason I mention that is it's in the letter here. So the DBS have followed up from the GMC strike of saying I've emotionally abused vulnerable adults. And the second thing is I was willing to flout international policy and safeguarding regulations and allowed my own opinion to override safeguarding rules. Now, they couldn't ever name the rule that I'd broken. There was no rule, there was no law, there was no international regulation, but they've used that now and they've made a big leap to say, because you were willing to flout safeguarding rules, that if you work with children in the future, that this will be a danger to them and that you'll be some sort of safeguarding risk. So they've made an application, yet another legal fight, yet another cost, getting a team together to fight this. I've got 8 weeks to appeal. Else they're going to put me on the DBS bar list for vulnerable adults and children based upon, having a debate with 3 doctors. And believe me, it was a toing and froing. It was a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, except the GMC wouldn't look at their 6, the 6 things that they said about me. It was all Dave Cartland said this with no context applied. I wrote 5 letters to support bodily autonomy, and I called out a practice manager that discriminated against me. She called me a rabid anti-vaxxer, and she rejected my CV saying that I was a rabid anti-vaxxer, and the Google search showed me to be one. I got 2 degrees and a master's, and this surgery is a surgery in trouble. So I was a little bit miffed. So I posted the email, fully redacted, didn't name her, I named the practice. And then she was playing victim. She said that I incited hate mail. So she had some mail sent to her at the surgery from Dr. Mike Yeadon, the World Council for Health, with 15 signatories, and a retired old chap called John Savage. He wouldn't mind me using his name. And they furnished this practice manager with the Pfizer documents. So hardly hate mail. There was no threats. But concerningly, the GMC have got this thing where if I post anything about anyone and you come on, Liz, later, and I know this is not like you, but swore about them and said, I think that doctor will burn in hell for promoting it in pregnancy, then I'm responsible. They call it incitement. So that was another string to their bow. They also said I showed hostility to the LGBTQ plus community simply for calling out some of the more obscene things that happen at Pride events with trans women, men in women's clothing, dancing around children, semi-clad. And I called it out publicly. They were mocking the crucifixion. We're both Christians, saying Jesus is a fag and stuff like that. I'd post and say, how is this right? How can people get away with this? Dancing in women's underwear, leaving nothing to the imagination with children visible. What that used to be called was child safeguarding, but now it's called hostility to the LGBTQ plus. And that was another charge they found me guilty of. It was an utterly bizarre job.
What's particularly sinister about this is, who tipped off the DBS? Like, is this normal that every doctor that's put in front of the GMC gets then checked by the DBS, or is this a special treatment for Dave Cartland? Well,
on the letter, they blacked out the name of the information something officer that has referred it on, but they're saying that it's just standard practice for that particular outcome, harassment. Now, there's not been any doctors struck off for harassment ever. And meanwhile, we're looking at doctors, and one of our defences was, where's the proportionality here? As I mentioned, 3 spats on Twitter, bilateral. And as I found out from the police, once you start interacting or responding to somebody who harasses you, the case is gone. It's null and void once you start interacting. So it's literally these 3 doctors, the vaccine letters, not exemptions, letters of support, and this calling out the practice manager. I mean, that was even more sinister. She tried to report me 4 times. Including on a Christmas day. I mean, how sad do you have to be to report Dave on Christmas Day? And at that point, the GMC responded with quite a thorough letter to her saying, look, he's done nothing wrong. He's quite entitled to, he's fully redacted everything. Then she's had a special delivery at the surgery, a brown envelope. Couldn't write it. And one of the trolls had sought her out and given her a screenshot that was so badly doctored, so badly photoshopped that my kids could have done a better job with the crayon. And they basically put her name, her date of birth, her address and her email address on top of the tweet. And like I say, it was a different font. It was depixelated. It was wonky. And I explained this to the GMC. Guess what? Wasn't allowed to use that. In fact, I didn't file a defence for this case, which I did, a 25-page document explaining all of this, but found guilty.
Yeah. Actually, to go back to this kangaroo court, because that chapter in your book, which comes towards the end, as I read it, I literally thought I was going to be sick. It was that bad. And then I just started to weep. It was so evil what you were subjected to. Like, you were denied a voice. You were being publicly shamed. You were being, you weren't allowed to have evidence. None of your witness statements were admissible. You weren't allowed to speak except through your barrister. You weren't allowed to be anonymous. You were public, and yet your accusers were allowed to be anonymous. It just was, they weren't even pretending to give you a fair trial. It was so far from a fair trial. It was, they just have no shame, because it was.
Well, they actually said, Liz, at one point, the Human Rights Act, we applied for strike-off of the case based upon breaches of 3 aspects of the Human Rights Act, fair trial, freedom of speech, etc. And they just came back and they deliberated for 2 or 3 hours while you sat under house arrest with your laptop going in and out of this virtual hearing. And they came out and they just said, no, we've decided that we're going to continue. We applied for various things throughout the process, the privacy order. Let's just do this behind closed doors. Bearing in mind the depths that they threw me, and the reason the case was adjourned was because I had a deterioration in my mental health. Became frankly suicidal at this witch hunt, losing my beloved career and my financial future, my reputation, all in one foul swoop. And it made me feel really, really depressed, and so that's why we adjourned it. So the GMC knew that going into the second half, that they'd adjourned the first half because of a suicide attempt. And I speak openly about that now because we know the GMC drive people who are under investigation to suicide. I think it's 1 in 3 contemplate suicide. And I know why now, because they treat you like an animal. They treat you like you're guilty. One of the first things they did, even before I've even had any evidence heard, was write to every single surgery in Cornwall that I worked at and every hospital saying, just to let you know, your locum Dr David Cartland has been accused of and will be investigated for harassment, bullying, incitement, LGBTQ plus hostility and falsifying medical notes. And that had gone out to all my practices, never worked at any of them again. So even in the run-up, the 3-year debacle, which, ended in the actual tribunal starting in earnest, is that they stopped me from working. And Cornwall's a place where bad news travels fast, and it's a very gossipy place. And so, one bad word, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, so people can hear how bad it really was. And it was absolutely immoral, illegal. I mean, the way they found out about the vaccine exemptions, as I mentioned, 2 of the GMC complainants reported it to the GMC on the same day. So this actor had sent the footage, the WhatsApp exchange, to these 2 victims of mine who submitted it on the same day, 15th of September, and almost word for word identical emails, word for word, like somebody had written it for them. It's just unbelievable. And you say to the GMC, this is entrapment and collusion, because these 2 doctors, and all these 3 doctors were chatting to each other online as well. I reported it on Monday. I suggest you do the same. I'll do it on Wednesday. Got them, and they're in their speeches, they're saying that they don't know each other. I mean, there's nothing.
It was the biggest pile-on, wasn't it? Because it wasn't just individuals. It was, you were up against these powerful bodies, your regulators, the justice system, the police, social services, everybody. The DBS now have joined in, and you were not even allowed to speak. And I cannot imagine how that must make you. I mean, it is nothing short of a miracle, by the grace of God, that you're actually still here, because I think what you have endured has been obscene, and it's been unrelenting, and it's just been multiple sources, and then the media, you've kind of got everybody. And as I said to you earlier, what Andrew Wakefield endured was horrific, but what you described is taking it to a whole nother level.
I was a double page spread in the local Cornishman newspaper. One was the trolls had managed to contact several people in my personal life. They wanted hit pieces for my ex-wife, neighbours, friends, colleagues. They were actively going out and seeking these people, digging for dirt on me. But they got the ear of the local editor of the newspaper, Cornwall Live. He wrote about 8 or 9 hit pieces about me in 2 weeks. Now, it was unprecedented for a paper to publish so many articles, all disparaging, and they actually published that I was struck off 2 days before I was struck off. I mean, that's how corrupt it was.
Wow.
How corrupt it was. They actually published that I was going to be struck off. I mean, it's no one's explained that to me. And then they went digging through my social media, and they wrote a hit piece, and the headline was, and I'll quote it exactly, "Cost you 40,000 to fight this in court to sue." It said, "Inside the warped mind of dodgy, struck-off Cornwall GP and his homophobic worldview." So they'd gone on then to look at social media posts they believed were homophobic. And I'll give you one example. One was a picture of Sam Smith, the singer, and he had this massive mushroom outfit, feather boa, etc. And I put human evolution. That's it. That's the post. I put another one about a man holding an umbrella above his wife and 2 children. It said, "Man, woman, boy, girl. I'm a father and I'm protecting my children from gender confusion. How's that homophobic?" And they go on for several. Remember Little Britain? "I'm a lady." The guys that went, "I'm a lady." And it's just mocking that's actually become reality now. It's nothing to do with homosexuality. It's to do with the trans agenda. And I see trans agenda as something highly sinister and a safeguarding concern. Simple as that. I'm entitled to that opinion. It certainly isn't homophobia.
But I wonder, so you've probably had a lot of time to think about this, but if you had your time again, knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently regarding how you engage with the trolls? And what would you advise other people if find themselves in that position to do? What would your...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've reflected and, I've tried to find fault in myself. How have I got in this situation? Absolutely. I'd use the analogy of a bear. If you keep poking a bear, the bear's going to attack. But what the GMC were doing, we're taking Polaroid snaps of me attacking. And I have done before. I mean, I was going to think of one example. I don't think it's appropriate to go on the UK collar really, but I forget what I was going to say. But ultimately, I've poked back. These people have abused me, multifaceted attempts at, ruining every aspect of my life. So occasionally I will, share an expletive with them. What I tended to do was call them out. So a lot of my stalkers, I'll put a picture of them and say, this is Mr. X. He lives in so-and-so. He's posted about a stranger in Cornwall 585 times in the last 2 months. Does your wife know you do this? Things like that. So, professionalism at all times. But when you're provoked, when they're threatening everything from your, I've got 4 children. I've got to support I've just lost 120 grand a year salary to be replaced by joblessness. I can't get a job. I've been applying to driving jobs, just normal minimum wage stuff, the refereeing I mentioned, and they're even trying to stop that. And they're getting a CV from a guy who's got 2 medical degrees and a master's, and they're saying, well, why does he want to drive for Amazon? And then they Google me, and it's not a pretty sight. If you Google Dave Cartland, I wouldn't employ me. But yeah, I think, going back to the original question, a bit more restraint. I have been provoked, and I'm an emotional guy. Yes, I know that I've been kind of operating as a lone wolf, screaming into the abyss. That's how I've kind of positioned myself to avoid any politics. But when it's every day, day in, day out, 5 years, and, it's been the GMC, they didn't just hurry it up. They're 3 years until the start of the tribunal. They were adding stuff on. Yeah. They were telling me that even if
it was designed to push you to your limits, obviously.
Well, in the end, not many people know this. They wrote to me again during the tribunal and said, we're going to come after you again. We're going to have another MPTS if you win. So I basically posted 3 naturopathic cancer supplement protocols from other people. And I put a disclaimer saying, this is not my protocol. These are from reputable naturopaths such as Sarah Myhill, Barbara O'Neill, etc. Please seek medical advice and discuss with your oncologist before commencing any of these supplements. That was it. GMC rang me up and said, we've made a decision at senior level. This is your next MPTS. You're promoting cancer cures in breach of the Cancer Act. It's like, hang on. So they were already lining up.
That's against the Cancer Act, isn't it? It's really scary that you can't claim that anything apart from chemotherapy or radiation or surgery can treat or cure cancer. That's that was brought in decades ago. It's quite frightening. Yeah. So what do you think now? My conclusion, reading your book, was that you've been subjected to a very concerted effort by some extremely powerful people, possibly the deep state intelligence agencies, to literally destroy you. So they didn't just want your career, they wanted to destroy your life. And I think what you describe in your book is pure evil. So this level of targeting, harassment, is not down to a few deranged individuals. It's clearly orchestrated, extremely well funded, and extremely influential. So what are your thoughts as to who or what is behind this campaign? Because this isn't just a group of doctors who are annoyed with you. This isn't just, a GMC who can't run a court case. There's something very, very dark that's sort of, you're pulling the strings in this.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the sheer amount of these characters and how far they're prepared. I mean, only this week, I was walking along the beach and I thought I'd do a kind of ad hoc video. I use CBD oil. And I just wrote a 2-minute video saying, I've been using CBD oil. It's really good for anxiety, stress, and it's helping me sleep at the moment during stressful times. End of video, posted it. 2 days later, Advertising Standards Agency write a letter to me, reported by the trolls. My website's up and running for the new health coaching. And it's been reported already for one page that we forgot to add to it about data protection, etc. Been reported to the ICO already. So yeah, I mean, these people know exactly, because sometimes I test it. I'll put a post up and remove it within 12 seconds, 10 seconds. They've captured it. So they've got technology, and I know people who privately investigated these people and found the technology that they use, and it's pretty high tech stuff. And these characters are dotted all the way around the world. I've got a stalker in Costa Rica, Canada, an expat up in Thailand running some sleazy massage parlour. So whoever they are, I mean, they're recruiting some real dross of society. I mean, they all tend to have some ex-military connection, for sure. Even this Costa Rican couple I've just found out, they're both ex-military. A lot of the trials have got nods to Freemasonry, nods to openly nodding that they're Freemasons, openly nodding that they're ex-military personnel. And so there's obviously accusations at 77th Brigade who openly admit to what they do. There's other organisations, NGOs like CCDH, they're heavily involved, CCDH. Oh, yeah. At the beginning, we had Project Halo, and that kind of morphed into something else. And you've got Reality Team and CTI League. Go to any of their websites. They tell you exactly what they do. Neutralise, they use that word, neutralise targets. And they're quite open. So I don't know exactly who they are. I'd love to know.
They obviously, I'm thinking about what their goal is. I mean, you must have been right over the target. Like what you were doing had the potential to bring everything down. So you were, little Dave Cartland in Cornwall was a massive threat to this huge global enterprise going on. And they wanted to make an example of you, of course, to terrify other doctors who, because they knew there would be people that would want to speak out. So they have to really go for a few to shut up the many.
Yeah, I was watching as all of my fellow dissenters were picked off one at a time. We had Sarah Myhill, Mohammed Adil, Sam White, my good friend Dan Armstrong. He was struck off for, quote, questioning the safety and efficacy of the COVID vaccine. That was the reason. That was it. Oh, dear. And even one of the GMC guys wore a Freemason pin and the Freemason tie while he was in the tribunal because Dan called him out on it. And he got very flustered when he mentioned Freemasonry. But, to seek legal recourse here, Liz, I mean, the whole GMC case cost me 80,000 quid in legal costs, right? I didn't have any MPS or whatever it's called now. I'll get to the end of that and you get 1 month to appeal. Obviously, I took to my bed for about a month. I was licking my wounds. I never had a shave. I barely had a shower, barely ate. Just hit a massive depression because of its sheer velocity. And they're expecting you to formulate an appeal. And they wanted 20,000 quid plus VAT. And if you lose, you pay the GMC's costs. And they got 2 barristers on $6,000 a day. So there's a financial disincentive. And then you get 3 months to do a judicial review from the strike-off date. And so I entertained that idea. I raised a crowd fund for it. And then other civil litigations intercepted there to take that fund away, this specific exact figure that I needed. You need 50,000 quid. 50,000 quid to go to judicial review just to even get the ear of a judge to listen to this. I mean, no one in the land would say that it was a just tribunal at all. To not allow a defendant witnesses for starters. One's our very own Ross Jones wrote a character reference. They've received 380 positive testimonies about me from various walks of life, from friends and family to ex-patients, etc. The GMC legally qualified chair said, we're not going to include this in the bundle for Dr Cartland's defence because they do not the people writing the testimonies do not understand the intricacies and details of this case. It doesn't really matter what the case is about. It's a standalone testimony saying about my good nature and good character. They wouldn't even read them. Anything that was positive about me, unbelievable, unprecedented. I think my barrister had to have about 3 months off to recover. He's never seen anything like it.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you describe in your book, this literally took you to the brink, to the edge of a cliff in your darkest moment. But thankfully, you're here to tell the tale. And looking forward to the future, you're now embarking on new projects. You've got your health coaching and podcasting, which is really exciting. And I just wonder, how has your faith helped you to get through this journey? And what are your reflections on what you've been through over the last few years and how you make sense of this journey you've been on?
Yeah, I mean, going right back to the beginning of the pandemic, I felt the church was a letdown. I was a new zealous Christian learning the biblical principles and a biblical way of life. And the church shut its doors in the faces of people and reverted to Zoom prayer meetings. And we lost about a third of the flock, as it were, from our church in Penzance, and never to return, and silly rules being practiced. And I'm saying what really disappointed me was the spiritual battle that was clearly being fulfilled in the 5 years that we've seen it. I called it prophetic bingo. So part of my testimony becoming a Christian was looking at the Bible and what came true from Old to New Testament. And in the recent years, we're seeing, Romans 1 come true, 2 Thessalonians 2 born out in the pandemic. There'll be a grand delusion that even the elect will be deceived. It says it in clear text, really, 2 Timothy 3 generation. And I'm sort of ticking these off in my head. And all you're getting from the church is, I think it's Romans 13, isn't it? Always, succumb to what the government tell you to do and sort of ignoring the higher power in God. So I've took my spiritual journey to a more personal level. You know, and I think that's biblical as well, isn't it? Because it talks about the Pharisees making an outward show of their religion. I call it churchiality. People who turn up on a Sunday and pray and sing and make a big show and then forget their Christian ethos. I've not heard from any person, brother or sister in Christ, from my church anyway, since I've been struck off. In fact, one of the only Christian doctors I know in the area said, "Dave, you should never have jeopardised your career on this." He said he kept using the phrase, and it really upset me, because he's a guy who quit medicine to become a pastor of an evangelical church. He said, "This was never a hill on which to allow your career to die." I'm saying, well, there's genocide and pregnant women and children and deaths and harm and clots and strokes, and you're saying it's not a hill to die on. Well, what is a hill to die on in your view? And then he ended up blocking me. So
that's it. Absolutely shocking.
But yeah, my parents severely tested. Severely tested.
Told. You're right. It's all there in the Bible. And I think actually those of us who can see the spiritual perspective, actually, that is life enhancing. And that really, because you understand the bigger picture and you recognize that where you're standing, you're in the good fight and you are on the right side of history. You are on the right side of this battle, and history will judge you very well in the end. So, and you've now published 2 books. So your anthology of poetry, which was a doctor's and your latest.
Flash them up.
This one.
That worked out well, actually, split screen.
Yeah, brilliant. Do No Harm, Diaries of a Vaccinated Anti-Vaxxer, which I would encourage everyone to buy, and there will be a link in the show notes to both the books. Do you enjoy writing? Has it been therapeutic? And are there more books there that in your head to be written?
Yeah, it's a little known secret about me. If I never made it as a doctor, I would have been either a journalist or some sort of English literature was my love through school. That's why it took me so long to get to med school, because I didn't do all the classic chemistry, physics. I did English literature, maths and something else, biology. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, really. And yeah, I love it. I mean, the poetry book came about from an insomnia period. I was just waking up at 3 o'clock, getting some rhyming couplets in my head and thought, let's get these down. So I had sat there with my phone and sort of added. I've been writing these poems in 10 minutes flat. And, you know, I've called one COVID cultist, one blind obedience, maskaholics, keyboard warriors, a little nod to the trolls, a little ode to them and the characters that they are. And I've just sort of put it together with a group of other outspoken doctors and people who've been in the quote awake communities, and it's formed an anthology. And I really hope that people enjoy the contents. And as you mentioned, the other book is my side of the story. And something that really concerned me was my arch nemesis Jeremy Vine posted on Twitter, he put on Twitter to all of his followers, Cartland's legacy to his children and grandchildren will be his Google search. And that really, like a dagger, hit me. And I thought, I've got to get my own version of events down. I've never spoke about Jeremy Vine, by the way, never ever. But he decided to state that I've been abusive to him apparently as well in another life. But yeah, he put this thing about the legacy to my grandchildren and children. And so I thought, no, I'm going to give them a proper legacy that isn't run by Google. It's going to be my poetry. It's going to be my story within Do No Harm. And yeah, I think maybe there might be a sort of future in fiction maybe as well. I might write some stories about my career, but as a third person. Tell some of the tales, the anecdotes that I cover in the Do No Harm. That's some of the characters.
Okay, well, we can definitely look forward to that. And then despite everything you've been through, you're still continuing to speak out and help others, which is just such a testament to your character, with your health coaching business, which we'll have a link in the notes, and your Breaking the Silence podcast. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about your work in those areas? Yeah,
I think my barrister left me with a message actually as we sort of closed our work together with the GMC. He said, don't get mad, get even. Get even. So I think I'm going to continue my work to get even, to continue to whistleblow. And I always consider, I say this a lot in interviews, that I always imagine a scenario in, you know, 3 years, not 3 years, in 30 years where my grandkids say, Dad, what did you do? Granddad, what did you do? And I'll show them these videos and say, look, in amongst all the silence and heads down and, you know, all the cognitive dissonance, Daddy, Granddad spoke up. And I'll sleep well knowing that. So, yeah, the podcast itself, the principle is to get NHS whistleblowers that haven't particularly had a platform. Science background. I've done some interviews with people, international folk who are from pharma, nursing backgrounds, etc., caring backgrounds, telling their story. There's also a series on vaccine injury case studies as well. So I've interviewed people who've just told their story. I've not intimated it's vaccine injury. That's the conclusion they've come to. And some of the shenanigans that they've got up to with the medics gaslighting them, telling them they're all making up their symptoms for fun, functional neurological disorders, the latest trend. and letting them have a platform. And I've deliberately made it really low tech. I literally record it in this room on my old battered laptop from uni. I press record with no script, and we roll the cameras, and it's going really well on YouTube. It's really, because I was banned on YouTube until 2 months ago. They reinstated, so I got the idea to transfer the Substack across to. I'm officially a YouTuber now. So again, if anyone wants to,
a few thousand followers there, haven't you already? I noticed that today. About 5.5.
Yeah, so I'm trying my best really to make scraps of money from monetizing these things. You don't make a lot of money from it, but a couple of £100 for posting videos a month all adds to the coffers.
How can people best help and support you? Where can we find your work, and what can we do to help you?
Just spread the word. I think I've suffered a lot from censorship, and obviously if you Google me, the reputational damage is there for everyone to see. So if everyone, we really grew the health coaching business before the trolls got to my business partner, and then he had to run for the safety of his family and kids because they were threatening him and stalking him. So we've had to rebuild, and it really relies on word of mouth. So if people, use the service or they see the website and they like it, share it. I mean, you'll get attacked by trolls, but nonetheless, just promoting the books as well. I'd love every single GP, if anyone's thinking about a Christmas present, for 15 quid, you can get yourself a poetry book and do no harm. Pop it through the door of your GP and the chief vaccinator and enlighten them as to what happens. I'd love it to be on every GP's Christmas list.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cartland, for sharing your story and experiences so honestly and vulnerably. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners are as horrified as I am by what you've endured, but I hope they're also heartened and inspired by your passion for truth and your immense courage in the face of evil. Your erasure from the medical register is a massive loss to your patients and to the medical profession, who have lost a brilliant, compassionate and ethical doctor who always put his patients first. But I hope and pray that one day you will be reinstated and that justice and truth will prevail. And in the meantime, I just wish you all the best with your new projects and book sales, and do encourage everyone to buy a copy to show their support for you and the brave stand you've taken to uphold medical ethics. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Liz. Always a pleasure.